Dr. Maya Richardson's morning started like any other Tuesday in Atlanta. The sun was barely peeking through the clouds as she gathered her files and laptop, preparing for another busy day at her private therapy practice. She had spent extra time that morning making sure she looked professional in her navy blue blazer and matching pants, her natural hair neatly styled in a classic bun. The clock on her kitchen wall showed 7:45 a.m., giving her plenty of time to reach her office for her first appointment at 9:00 a.m. Maya always liked to arrive early to review her patient files and prepare for the day's sessions. Today was especially important as she was meeting a new client, a police officer dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. As she drove her silver Honda Accord down the familiar streets, Maya's mind wandered to the challenging cases she had scheduled for the day. She had been a licensed therapist for 8 years now, specializing in trauma and racial bias counseling. Her practice had grown steadily, earning her respect among both her colleagues and clients. The traffic was heavier than usual that morning. A minor accident on the highway had forced her to take an alternate route through downtown. Maya glanced at her car's digital clock, 8:15 a.m. She was still on schedule but cutting it closer than she liked. As she approached an intersection, the traffic light turned yellow. Making a split-second decision, she pressed the accelerator slightly, clearing the intersection just as the light changed. The flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror made her heart sink. Maya carefully pulled over to the right, positioning her car in a safe spot by the curb. She took a deep breath, remembering all the times she had counseled her clients about staying calm in similar situations. Her hands moved automatically to the steering wheel, keeping them visible as she had learned to do. A white police officer, who appeared to be in his mid-30s, approached her window. "License and registration, ma'am," he said, his tone clipped and professional. Maya noticed his nameplate read, "Officer Thompson." "Good morning, officer," Maya responded politely, keeping her movements slow and deliberate as she reached for her documents. "My license is in my purse, and I'll get the registration from the glove compartment." The officer watched carefully as she retrieved the requested items. Maya couldn't help but notice how his hand rested near his weapon, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes about ingrained biases she often discussed in her therapy sessions. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Thompson asked, examining her license with a slight frown. "I assume it's about the yellow light at the last intersection," Maya replied calmly, maintaining eye contact when the officer looked at her. "You ran a red light, ma'am," he stated firmly. "The light was already red when your vehicle entered the intersection." Maya wanted to disagree. She was certain the light had still been yellow, but her professional experience told her this wasn't the time for an argument. "I apologize, officer. I was trying to get to my office. That's no excuse for unsafe driving." Officer Thompson's expression remained skeptical as he looked between her and her license. Her professional attire and well-maintained car seemed to contrast with whatever assumptions he had made. "Where do you work?" he asked, his tone suggesting curiosity mixed with doubt. "I have a private practice downtown," Maya answered simply, choosing not to mention her credentials unless specifically asked. Years of experience had taught her that sometimes less information led to fewer complications. "I see," he replied, though his tone suggested he didn't quite believe her. "Wait here." He returned to his patrol car with her documents. Maya sat patiently, watching in her side mirror as the officer ran her information. The morning sun was higher now, and she could feel its warmth through the car window. Her phone showed 8:30 a.m. She would definitely need to call her office to reschedule her first appointment. After what seemed like an eternity, Officer Thompson returned with a ticket book in hand. "I'm issuing you a citation for running a red light," he announced, handing her a yellow slip along with her license and registration. "The fine is $275, and instructions for payment or contesting the ticket are on the back." Maya accepted the ticket gracefully, thanking the officer despite her frustration. As she watched him walk away in her rearview mirror, she knew this wouldn't be the end of the matter. She had seen too many similar situations in her therapy practice to let this incident go unchallenged. She would have her day in court, though she had no idea how eventful that day would turn out to be. 2 weeks after receiving the ticket, Maya walked into the downtown courthouse at 8:30 a.m. sharp. The imposing building, with its tall marble columns and wide stone steps, made her feel small despite her professional confidence. She had chosen her outfit carefully that morning, a classic black pencil skirt, crisp white blouse, and low heels that clicked softly against the polished floor. The security line moved slowly as people emptied their pockets and walked through metal detectors. Maya noticed she was one of only 3 black people in the crowded lobby. As a therapist, she was trained to observe such details, and the demographic disparity didn't surprise her, though it still made her heart heavy. Following the signs to traffic courtroom 304, Maya found herself in a packed courtroom. The wooden benches were filled with people from all walks of life, some in suits, others in work uniforms, and a few looking like they had just rolled out of bed. She managed to find a spot on a backbench next to an elderly white woman who smiled kindly at her. "First time here," the woman whispered as Maya settled in. Maya nodded, keeping her voice low. "Is it that obvious?" "You look too nervous to be a regular," the woman chuckled softly. "I'm here supporting my grandson. Word of advice. Judge Hartley doesn't like excuses, so keep it brief and respectful." Before Maya could respond, a court officer's voice boomed through the room. "All rise. The Honorable Judge William Hartley presiding." Everyone stood as Judge Hartley entered the courtroom. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that sat low on his nose. His black robe seemed to make him even more imposing as he took his seat at the bench. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice carrying authority that immediately silenced any remaining whispers in the room. Maya watched carefully as case after case was called. She noticed a pattern emerging that made her professional instincts kick in. Judge Hartley's tone and demeanor seemed to shift subtly depending on who stood before him. With well-dressed white defendants, his tone was almost fatherly as he reviewed their cases. But when minorities or less affluent-looking people approached the bench, his voice took on a harder edge. A young Hispanic man in work boots and paint-stained jeans tried to explain that he couldn't afford his speeding ticket. "Your Honor, I'm a single father working 2 jobs." "We all have responsibilities, Mr. Garcia." Judge Hartley cut him off sharply. "Perhaps you should have thought about your children before breaking the law. Fine stands as written." The man's shoulders slumped as he walked away from the bench. Maya felt her jaw tighten, recognizing the familiar dance of systemic bias she so often discussed with her clients. A well-dressed white businessman approached next, charged with the same offense as Mr. Garcia. "Your Honor, I was rushing to an important meeting." "Ah, yes, Mr. Thompson. I see you have a clean driving record otherwise." Judge Hartley's tone warmed considerably. "I'll reduce the fine by half. Just be more careful next time." Maya pulled out her notebook, the same one she used for session notes, and began documenting these interactions. Her therapeutic training kicked in as she observed the patterns of behavior, the subtle shifts in body language, and the varying tones of voice. "Richardson, Maya," the court officer finally called. Maya stood, smoothing her skirt and gathering her documents. As she walked toward the bench, she could feel Judge Hartley's eyes following her. His expression changed almost imperceptibly as he took in her professional appearance, a flicker of something. Surprise, perhaps. Crossing his face before his stern mask returned. "Ms. Richardson," he began, emphasizing the Ms. in a way that made Maya's spine straighten. "You're here contesting a ticket for running a red light. What's your excuse?" The condescension in his tone was familiar. She had heard it many times before, both personally and through her clients' stories. But Maya remained calm, drawing on years of professional experience in handling difficult situations. What happened next would change not only her day but the entire courthouse's approach to justice. Maya stood before Judge Hartley's bench, her case file held firmly in her hands. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and she could feel dozens of eyes watching from the gallery behind her. The judge peered down at her over his reading glasses, his expression a mixture of boredom and mild irritation. "Your Honor," Maya began in a clear, steady voice, "I'd like to contest the timing of the light change. I believe it was still yellow when I entered the intersection." Judge Hartley's eyebrows rose slightly. "Officer Thompson's report states otherwise, Ms. Richardson. Are you suggesting a trained police officer doesn't know the difference between yellow and red?" A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Maya noticed how the judge's lips curled into a slight smirk, as if sharing a private joke with his audience. She had seen this behavior before, the subtle way authority figures sometimes tried to diminish others to maintain control. "No, Your Honor," Maya replied calmly. "I'm simply stating my observation of events. Additionally, I'd like to request a reduction in the fine amount. The judge's expression hardened. And why should I reduce your fine, Ms. Richardson? Do you have some special circumstances that make you above the law? Maya took a deep breath, maintaining her professional composure. I work with clients on a sliding scale, Your Honor, which means my income can vary month to month. The full fine would be a significant burden at this time. Judge Hartley leaned forward, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made several spectators shift uncomfortably in their seats. So, you're telling me you're unemployed? Living off government assistance, perhaps? The assumption hung heavy in the air. Maya felt her throat tighten, but years of professional training helped her maintain her calm exterior. She noticed the elderly woman from earlier shaking her head in disapproval at the judge's words. No, Your Honor, Maya responded, her voice steady despite the mounting tension. I run my own private practice. A private practice? Judge Hartley's tone dripped with skepticism. And what sort of practice would that be? The way he emphasized the word practice made it clear he didn't believe her. Maya could hear whispers from the gallery behind her. She thought about all her clients who had faced similar moments of prejudice and discrimination. This was exactly the kind of situation she helped them navigate. I'm a licensed clinical therapist, Your Honor, Maya stated firmly. I specialize in trauma counseling and racial bias training. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. Judge Hartley's face flickered with surprise before he quickly composed himself. A therapist? Do you have proof of these credentials? Maya opened her briefcase and pulled out her licenses and certifications. The court officer carried them to the judge, who examined them with growing discomfort. I've been practicing for 8 years, Maya continued, her professional training giving her the strength to push forward. In fact, I frequently work with law enforcement agencies on cultural competency training. I help officers and legal professionals recognize and address implicit biases that can affect their decision-making. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Judge Hartley's face had turned a shade redder as he realized the hole he had dug for himself. He shuffled papers on his desk, clearly trying to regain his composure. I find it interesting, Your Honor, Maya added, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, that you immediately assumed I was unemployed or on government assistance, despite my professional appearance and clear articulation. It's exactly the kind of implicit bias I address in my workshops. Several people in the gallery nodded in agreement. The court clerk had stopped typing, her hands frozen over her keyboard as she watched the scene unfold. Even the court officer stood straighter, sensing the significance of the moment. Judge Hartley cleared his throat, his earlier confidence visibly shaken. He looked down at Maya's credentials again, then back at her, seeing her truly for the first time. The power dynamic in the courtroom had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The next few moments would prove crucial not only for Maya's case but for the entire courthouse's approach to justice and equality. The tension in courtroom 304 was thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Hartley removed his glasses and wiped them slowly with a cloth from his pocket, a gesture that Maya recognized as a common stress response. She had seen similar behaviors in her therapy sessions when clients faced uncomfortable truths. Dr. Richardson, Judge Hartley said finally, emphasizing her proper title this time. Perhaps you could elaborate on your work with law enforcement agencies. Maya felt the shift in the room as the judge used her professional title. She straightened her shoulders and took this opportunity to transform the moment into something meaningful. Certainly, Your Honor, she replied, her voice carrying the same confident tone she used during her professional workshops. I work with police departments across 3 counties, helping officers understand how unconscious biases can affect their decision-making in the field. She paused, noting how several people in the gallery leaned forward to listen. Even the court officer had turned slightly toward her, interest evident on his face. Last month, I conducted a workshop for the downtown precinct about traffic stops, Maya continued. We discussed how split-second decisions can be influenced by preconceived notions about a person's appearance, race, or economic status. These biases often operate without our conscious awareness. Judge Hartley's face had lost its earlier redness, replaced by a thoughtful pallor. He gestured for her to continue, his usual stern demeanor softening slightly. In fact, Maya added, Opening her briefcase again, I have some interesting statistics about traffic stop outcomes in our county. She pulled out a familiar report, one she often used in her presentations. Would you be interested in seeing how citation rates vary based on demographic factors? The judge looked at the growing number of eyes watching him from the gallery. The elderly woman who had spoken to Maya earlier nodded encouragingly from her seat. Even the court clerk had stopped pretending to type and was openly watching the exchange. Dr. Richardson, Judge Hartley spoke, his voice noticeably different from his earlier tone. I suspect you're about to tell me something that might make me rather uncomfortable. Growth often begins with discomfort, Your Honor, Maya responded gently, drawing on her years of experience in handling sensitive discussions. In my practice, I've found that the most meaningful changes happen when people are willing to acknowledge their discomfort and learn from it. A young black man in the gallery whispered, Amen, loud enough for several people to hear. Someone else murmured in agreement. Your Honor, Maya continued, every day in my practice, I see people struggling with the effects of prejudice and bias. Some are victims, some are perpetrators, and many are both. The real breakthrough comes when people in positions of authority are willing to examine their own biases openly. Judge Hartley picked up Maya's credentials again, studying them more carefully this time. She could see him taking in her impressive list of qualifications, her doctorate from Emory University, her specialized certifications in trauma counseling, and her extensive experience in cultural competency training. The interesting thing about bias, Maya added, her voice warm but professional, is that it doesn't make someone a bad person. We all have biases. The question is, what do we do when we recognize them? The courtroom remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, not the tense quiet of earlier, but rather the thoughtful pause that comes before understanding. Maya noticed several people nodding, including some of the white defendants who had witnessed the earlier exchanges. Judge Hartley placed both hands on his desk and leaned forward slightly. The stern mask he usually wore had cracked, revealing something more human underneath. In that moment, he wasn't just a judge looking down from his bench. He was a person confronting his own prejudices in front of a room full of witnesses. Dr. Richardson, he said, his voice carrying a new note of respect, I believe you've given us all something important to think about today. He paused, looking around the courtroom before focusing back on Maya. Would you be willing to continue this discussion in my chambers after today's session? The question hung in the air, representing something much larger than a simple conversation about a traffic ticket. It was an opportunity for real change, not just for one judge, but potentially for the entire courthouse system. After the morning session ended, Maya found herself in Judge Hartley's chambers. The room was exactly what she expected: dark wood panels, leather-bound law books, and certificates covering the walls. The judge had removed his black robe, and in his gray suit, he looked more human, more approachable. Please, have a seat, Dr. Richardson, Judge Hartley said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. His voice had lost its earlier harshness, replaced by something that sounded almost like embarrassment. Maya sat down, placing her briefcase beside her. She noticed a family photo on his desk, the judge with what appeared to be his daughter at her college graduation. The young woman was smiling proudly in her cap and gown, standing next to a black female friend in matching graduation attire. I owe you an apology, Judge Hartley began, running a hand through his silver hair. My behavior in the courtroom today was, well, it was exactly the kind of bias you probably discuss in your workshops. Maya nodded, maintaining her professional demeanor. Recognition is the first step toward change, Your Honor. Please call me William in here, he said, sighing heavily. I've been on this bench for 23 years. I've always prided myself on being fair, on following the law to the letter. He paused, looking at the family photo. But today, you made me see something I've been blind to. Would you like to talk about what you noticed? Maya asked, naturally falling into her role as a therapist. Judge Hartley turned back to her, his blue eyes showing genuine concern. I watched the video recordings of this morning's session during our break. The difference in how I spoke to different defendants was striking. I didn't even realize I was doing it. Maya pulled out the statistics report she had mentioned earlier. Would you like to see the data I referenced? It shows some interesting patterns in traffic court rulings across our district. The judge leaned forward, accepting the document. As he read through the numbers, His frown deepened. The statistics showed clear disparities in fine reductions and dismissals based on race and apparent economic status. "This is troubling," he said finally, placing the report on his desk. "But what troubles me more is that I never questioned it before. My daughter," he gestured to the graduation photo, "she's been telling me about these issues for years. She volunteers with civil rights organizations on campus." Maya smiled gently. "Sometimes it takes a personal experience to open our eyes to larger truths." Judge Hartley stood up and walked to his window, looking out over the courthouse square below. "You know, I was planning to retire next year," he said quietly. "But now I'm thinking, maybe I have some important work to do first." "What kind of work are you thinking about?" Maya asked, watching him carefully. He turned back to face her. "Your workshops with law enforcement. Could something similar be done here? For judges, court officers, the whole staff?" Maya felt a spark of hope. This was exactly the kind of systemic change she had always worked toward. "It's definitely possible. I've developed training programs specifically for legal professionals." "And would you be willing to help us implement such a program?" The judge's voice was eager now, showing none of the defensiveness from earlier. "I may be just one judge, but I have some influence with the Judicial Review Board." Maya thought about all her clients who had faced bias in the legal system, about Mr. Garcia from this morning, about countless others who had stood before judges feeling powerless and prejudged. "Of course," she replied. "Change happens one conversation at a time, one person at a time. Today might have started with a traffic ticket, but it could lead to something much more significant." Judge Hartley nodded, a small smile forming on his face. "Dr. Richardson, I think you've given me more than just a lesson in bias today. You've given me a chance to make my last years on the bench truly meaningful." The afternoon sun streamed through the chamber windows, casting long shadows across the room. In that moment, both Maya and Judge Hartley knew that this was more than just a meeting. It was the beginning of real change in their local justice system. The next morning, courtroom 304 was even more crowded than usual. Word had spread quickly about the previous day's events, drawing curious observers from other courtrooms. Maya sat in the front row this time, having been specifically asked to return by Judge Hartley. The usual morning buzz fell silent as the court officer called out, "All rise." The Honorable Judge William Hartley presiding. Judge Hartley entered, his black robe flowing behind him, but something was different about his demeanor. The stern mask he usually wore had been replaced by an expression of humility. He took his seat and adjusted his microphone. "Be seated," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Before we begin today's cases, I have something important to address." He paused, looking around the packed courtroom. "Yesterday, an incident occurred in this courtroom that requires my attention." The gallery remained silent, but Maya could feel the anticipation building. Mr. Garcia from the previous day was there, sitting a few rows behind her. She had noticed him when she walked in, his work boots still dusty from his morning job. "Dr. Maya Richardson came before this court yesterday," Judge Hartley continued, "and through her grace and professionalism, she showed me something about myself that I had been unwilling to see." He turned his gaze directly to Maya. "Dr. Richardson, would you please stand?" Maya rose slowly, smoothing her charcoal gray dress. All eyes in the courtroom turned to her. "Yesterday, I made assumptions about Dr. Richardson based solely on her appearance. I spoke to her with a condescension that was both unprofessional and unjust." The judge's voice carried clearly through the silent room. "As a judge, I am tasked with upholding justice equally for all people. Yesterday, I failed in that duty." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Several people nodded in agreement, while others looked surprised at this unusual display of judicial humility. Dr. Richardson is not only a licensed therapist but also an expert in cultural competency and bias training. She works with law enforcement and legal professionals to address the very kinds of prejudices I displayed yesterday. Judge Hartley removed his glasses, a gesture that made him appear more vulnerable. "In my 23 years on this bench, this is the first time I'm making a public apology, but it's long overdue." The court clerk had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she watched the unprecedented scene unfold. The court officer stood straighter, his usual stoic expression softened by surprise. "To Dr. Richardson, and to every person who has stood before me and felt prejudged or diminished, I'd offer my sincere apology. The judge's voice wavered slightly but remained strong. More importantly, I want to announce that changes will be made. Maya noticed several people leaning forward in their seats, including Mr. Garcia, whose expression showed a mix of disbelief and hope. Starting next month, this courthouse will implement mandatory cultural competency and bias awareness training for all judicial staff, including myself. Judge Hartley looked around the room, making eye contact with various observers. Dr. Richardson has agreed to help develop and lead this program. A spontaneous applause broke out in the gallery. The court officer moved to quiet the crowd, but Judge Hartley raised his hand. "Let them express themselves," he said quietly. "They've been silent too long." When the applause died down, the judge continued. "As for Dr. Richardson's traffic ticket," he picked up his gavel. "Case dismissed, and Dr. Richardson, thank you for teaching an old judge a valuable lesson." Maya nodded gracefully, feeling the weight of the moment. She could see tears in the eyes of some spectators, particularly those who had likely faced similar prejudices in their own court experiences. "Now," Judge Hartley said, shuffling the papers on his bench, "Mr. Garcia, would you please step forward? I believe we need to revisit your case from yesterday as well." The young Hispanic man stood up, surprise evident on his face. As he walked toward the bench, Maya could see the first real signs of change beginning to take shape in courtroom 304. What had started as a simple traffic ticket had transformed into a moment of true judicial reform. Over the next few weeks, the courthouse buzzed with activity as changes began taking shape. Maya's private practice had temporarily moved to a small office down the hall from Judge Hartley's chambers, where she spent her afternoons developing the training program. Her morning hours remained dedicated to her regular therapy clients, many of whom were inspired by hearing about her courthouse victory. On a warm Tuesday morning, Maya stood at the front of the courthouse's main conference room. The space was filled with judges, court officers, clerks, and administrative staff, nearly 60 people in total. Judge Hartley sat in the front row, notepad ready, looking more like an eager student than the stern judge he'd once been. "Bias isn't always obvious," Maya began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "Sometimes it hides in the small things, the tone of our voice, the assumptions we make, the way we interpret someone's appearance or behavior." She clicked to the next slide, showing a series of photographs. "These are all lawyers," she explained. "But in a study, people consistently assumed some were defendants based solely on their race or the way they dressed." From his seat, Judge Hartley nodded, remembering his own assumptions about Maya that first day. Other judges shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, perhaps recognizing similar mistakes they had made. "The good news," Maya continued, "is that awareness is the first step toward change. We can't eliminate bias overnight, but we can learn to recognize it and correct it." During the break, a young court clerk approached Maya. "Dr. Richardson," she said quietly, "I've been wanting to tell you something. I've worked here for 3 years, and I've seen so many people treated unfairly, but I never knew what to say or do about it." Maya smiled warmly. "And now I feel like we finally have permission to speak up," the clerk replied. "Yesterday, I heard a colleague make assumptions about a Spanish-speaking defendant. Instead of staying quiet, I suggested we get a proper translator. It felt good to say something." As the training sessions continued through the weeks, Maya noticed small but significant changes. Court officers began greeting everyone with the same respect, regardless of their appearance. Clerks took extra care to explain procedures clearly to all defendants. Judges became more conscious of their tone and language. Judge Hartley took his role as an advocate for change seriously. He scheduled regular meetings with Maya to discuss challenging cases and review his decisions. Sometimes, he would ask her to observe his courtroom and provide feedback on his interactions. One afternoon, as they reviewed the day's cases, Judge Hartley shared a story. "My daughter called last night," he said, smiling. "She'd heard about the changes we're making here from one of her civil rights group friends. She said she's proud of me. First time she said that about my work in years." Maya noticed a small photo frame on his desk that hadn't been there before. It showed a young black boy in a graduation cap. "My grandson," Judge Hartley explained, following her gaze. "My daughter adopted him last year. I keep thinking about the world he's going to grow up in, the way people might treat him. It makes all of this even more important." The transformation wasn't limited to the courthouse. Word spread through the legal community, and soon other districts began requesting similar training programs. Maya found herself hiring additional staff to meet the growing demand for cultural competency training. Mr. Garcia, whose case had been revisited that first day, became an unexpected ally. He volunteered to share his story at training sessions, talking about how it felt to be prejudged and then to witness the power of change. His children sometimes came to the courthouse after school, proud to see their father contributing to important reforms. 1 month into the program, Maya stood in courtroom 304, watching the afternoon session. The atmosphere had changed noticeably. There was more patience, more understanding, and most importantly, more genuine justice being served. As she observed the young black woman explaining her case to Judge Hartley, Maya heard none of the condescension that had been directed at her that first day. The traffic ticket that had brought her here had become so much more than a simple citation. It had become a catalyst for real change, proving that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with a single moment of courage and truth. 1 year had passed since Maya's fateful day in traffic court. The courthouse lobby now displayed a large plaque that read, "Justice sees no color," a phrase she had used in one of her first training sessions. Below it hung photographs of the diverse group of judges, officers, and staff who had completed the cultural competency program. On this particular morning, Maya sat in the back of courtroom 304, watching a ceremony that would have seemed impossible just 12 months ago. Judge Hartley stood at his bench, but today he wasn't hearing cases. Instead, he was presenting certificates to the first graduating class of the Courthouse Cultural Competency Program. When Dr. Richardson walked into this courtroom a year ago, Judge Hartley began, his voice carrying the warmth that had become his trademark. She didn't just contest a traffic ticket. She challenged us to be better, to see our biases and work to overcome them. The room was packed with courthouse staff, local media, and community members. Mr. Garcia sat in the front row with his children, all dressed in their Sunday best. His oldest daughter was now interning at the courthouse, inspired by the changes she had witnessed. In the past year, Judge Hartley continued, "We've seen remarkable changes. Our fine reduction rates now show no statistical difference across racial or economic lines. Our customer satisfaction surveys have improved by 60%. But most importantly, people tell us they feel heard and respected in our courthouse." Maya thought back to all the small victories over the past year. She remembered the elderly white bailiff who had tears in his eyes after realizing how his behavior had intimidated minority defendants. She thought of the young Hispanic clerk who was promoted to supervisor after showing exceptional leadership in implementing the new training protocols. The judge held up a thick folder. "I have here the results of our first-year audit. Our program has been so successful that 5 other courthouses in the state have adopted our model. Dr. Richardson's curriculum is now being considered for statewide implementation." Maya felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. She turned to see the elderly woman who had sat next to her that first day in court. "I knew something special was happening that day," the woman whispered, squeezing Maya's hand. "My grandson now works as a court translator, helping Spanish-speaking families understand their rights." At the front of the room, Judge Hartley was calling up each graduate. The line of people receiving certificates looked like America itself, diverse in age, race, and background. Each person had a story of how the program had changed their perspective. "And now," Judge Hartley announced, "I have one more announcement to make." He paused, looking directly at Maya. "As many of you know, I was planning to retire this year. However, I've decided to stay on for 2 more years to help establish this program in other districts. And I'm pleased to announce that Dr. Richardson has been appointed to the State Judicial Review Board as Special Advisor on Cultural Competency." The applause was thunderous. Maya felt tears forming in her eyes as she stood to acknowledge the crowd. This was never about a traffic ticket. It was about creating lasting change in a system that affected thousands of lives. After the ceremony, as people mingled over coffee and cake, a young black law student approached Maya. "Dr. Richardson," she said excitedly, "I read about what you did here. It inspired me to focus on judicial reform in law school. Would you consider being my mentor?" Maya smiled, remembering her own journey. "Of course," she replied. "Change happens one person at a time, one story at a time." As the afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, Maya watched Judge Hartley chatting with a diverse group of court officers. His grandson, now a year older, played nearby with Mr. Garcia's children. The courthouse that had once been a place of unspoken biases had transformed into a model of equality and justice. The traffic ticket that had brought her here was now framed in her office, not as a reminder of injustice, but as proof that one person standing up for what's right could create waves of change that touched countless lives. Maya's legacy wasn't just in the programs she created or the policies she changed. It was in the hearts and minds of everyone who learned to see beyond their biases and treat each person with the dignity they deserved.